2 weeks after the United States Supreme Court returned it to individual federal judges on habeas corpus petitions to decide whether the Alien Enemies Act was properly invoked by Donald Trump to remove people without due process and without any kind of notice. Well, the results are in. We've got 2 judges on Tuesday who decided to throw the book at the Trump administration. Judge Sweeney in Colorado, Senior Judge Hellerstein in New York. Both have said not only was the Alien Enemies Act not properly invoked because we're not at war with Venezuela, migration of people into this country, even criminals, is not the equivalent of enemy combatants being sent by a country or a nation state like Venezuela. That's one. And secondly, ever since the Supreme Court made its ruling in JGG versus the United States out of the Judge Boasberg case, the Supreme Court was quite clear. You got to go through the habeas corpus petition process, but you got to, government, give them due process and notice sufficient to uphold their Fifth Amendment constitutional standards. And that's what judges are now getting to the bottom of, defining what is notice, what is appropriate due process for these people. Now, look, you wouldn't need this level of due process if Trump wasn't trying to put all these people into a jail. Maybe an El Salvadoran jail, a Venezuelan jail, a New York jail, wherever. If he wasn't trying to detain them, if he was just trying to deport them and dump them off in their home countries for having violated some immigration law or some status that could be denied, that would be one thing. Well, then there's the immigration law that has to be followed, the administrative procedures that have to be followed. You get before an administrative law judge and you send these people packing, depending upon their status. But when you're talking about undocumented, alleged criminals, you got to prove your day in court. You got to give them a day in court. You got to prove it. You put to the proof as the government. So Judge Hellerstein just today, he actually said to a Department of Justice lawyer, the way you're describing this, and this no due process, no notice, and sending him off to CCOT in El Salvador, which is a notoriously dank, dark hole of a jail, never to be seen from again. You're talking medieval times. You're talking Inquisition. You're not talking about the United States of America. He went on to say, CCOT in El Salvador is notoriously bad. And what is the rush, Judge Hellerstein said from the bench, based on reporting there. He said, you already have these people in custody. What's the rush? Is the rush you need to get them out of the country to avoid jurisdiction? Because the Supreme Court says as long as they're in the United States, they're under individual federal judges' jurisdiction. Judge Sweeney said the same thing as Judge Hellerstein. Alien Enemies Act not properly invoked by Donald Trump. Due process rights are being violated. Judge Hellerstein went as far as to define what is notice, what is due process, because frankly, the Supreme Court, in its 1.5-page ruling, didn't get around to telling the courts what notice and due process is, leaving it to the courts to put some flesh on the bone. So it's up to Hellerstein to say the notice has to be in Spanish with a translator available with enough time to file the habeas corpus petition to advise the person of their rights. This is what is required. The Supreme Court used shorthand and code words and terms of art, leaving it to federal judges to fill in the blanks. And that's exactly what they've done. So we have a restraining order today for Judge Hellerstein. They got 2 orders coming off like the same issues, but showing you how federal judges are trying to act in this area. Colorado, preliminary injunction, blocks the use of the Alien Enemies Act, does not allow people in her jurisdiction, Judge Sweeney's jurisdiction, to go anywhere until notice is given that she's comfortable with and due process is given. And for the government to stand in front of Judge Hellerstein to say, well, due process is flexible and a sliding scale. Sure. Earlier on Monday, Donald Trump said, why do we have to give them due process at all? It's slowing down the process. We can't give everybody a trial. Right. You only have to give people the trial that you're trying to dump them off at the end of a process into jail or in permanent incarceration. Then you have to. It's very simple. Let me explain it to the Trump administration and the Department of Justice, because they seem to be getting all wrapped around their axle on very simple concepts. Meet me on camera 1. By the way, I only have 1 camera. Okay. If you want to deport people and remove them from this country, and they're not being subject to a criminal process that puts them in jail or permanent incarceration, and you're just revoking their status, then you either have to just go through the administrative procedures under the immigration law set by Congress and use an administrative law judge, and you can then send the person on their way back to their country. That's one. Two, if you have a way under the statute to revoke a person's status, temporary or otherwise, you can do that unless it requires, again, an administrative law judge process. That's two. And three, if the person that you're claiming that you have the power to get rid of is an enemy combatant, therefore a criminal, and you're invoking those provisions, and you're landing them not in their home country to be released, but you're landing them ultimately in a jail or detention center or concentration camp, a place where they're not free to leave, then you have to give them appropriate Fifth Amendment due process and notice to be defined by the federal judge. That's it. That's it. They want to make it more difficult because they want to confuse the population. They want to confuse their voters. It's not more difficult. And that's what Judge Hellerstein said today. He's not pleased with anything that he heard in the courtroom from the lawyers for the Department of Justice. And it was a scathing hearing today. Here's what's going to happen. He's kept that injunction in place longer. He's going to keep it in place at least another 3 or 4 weeks until he gets full briefing on the preliminary injunction. But nobody in that jurisdiction of Southern District of New York, which includes Manhattan and Orange County and a couple of other places, are going anywhere. So anybody that's in that processing center. Now, the downside of the Supreme Court making this go back to the various different districts and jurisdictions is that we don't have one judge handling all and grounding all of these planes. We did. His name was Judge Boasberg at the District of Columbia, but that's what the Supreme Court had a problem with. So now they didn't say they necessarily had a problem with class action status. It doesn't have to be just one detainee or petitioner, and it only applies to him. But they want it to be venue by venue, jurisdiction by jurisdiction. So we got to run around. ACLU is going to run around in all of these jurisdictions where all these detention and deportation facilities are. Right? And they've got to bring cases in those places. Now, if it's moderate or liberal places, like even the Southern District of Texas, including Austin or Colorado or New York, okay, then you're going to get a pretty good judge. But in the Northern District of Texas, where we have Judge Hendricks, who was appointed by Trump, he's just bending over backwards, taking his own sweet time. I'll get there. Oh, the planes are fueling. Oh, these guys are strapped into their chairs. Well, I'll get there in due course. Well, the ACLU said F that. They went to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. When the Fifth Circuit was moseying along there too, because that benefits Donald Trump, they ran to the United States Supreme Court on Saturday, this past Saturday. They filed their emergency application to stop these guys from being sent out of the jurisdictional power of the United States federal judges. And the Supreme Court moved with a speed I've never seen. I've never seen 60 and 70-year-olds and 50-year-olds move at this speed, except in a senior Olympics or one of those senior running races, where the guy's 100 years old and he runs the 100-yard dash in 4 minutes and 38 seconds like that. I've never seen these guys move so fast. 1 a.m. they issued their decision, blocking the Trump administration for the Northern District of Texas, but giving the signal based on these 3 pieces of paper issued by the United States Supreme Court, right? The ruling in favor of Abrego Garcia, the ruling that was 6-3 about notice and due process rights in the JGG case. And now this decision out of the Northern District of Texas that landed on their lap. And now you see from these 3 pieces of paper from the Supreme Court where their head is at. Notice, proper notice, due process, get in front of a judge. You got evidence, and nobody goes anywhere until, and we don't trust the Trump administration, if they tell us that the sky is blue and the grass is green, go out and check. That's where the Supreme Court is at right now. And the federal judges know it. And so they're emboldened, knowing that their bosses hopefully are going to support them. There's no other way to read those 3 decisions sequentially and piece them together and synthesize them than that. So I'm going to continue to follow it all right here on Legal AF. You're here already. Have I mentioned we're on a subscription drive? It's like the old PBS. You don't get a tote bag, though. Hit the red, whatever the color of the subscribe button is. Hit the subscribe button. The bigger we are, the easier it is for me to bring on some new voices, continue to grow the channel, bring on some amazing new content. We've already got up to, I think, almost 12 contributors here on a regular basis, all curated by me, Michael Popok, one of the leaders of Legal AF. So until my next report, I'm Michael Popok. In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories, the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.